everyone. My name is Dan Silverberg. I'm from Burning Glass Technologies, and I'm pleased to be moderating a panel called Learning to Arbitrage the Skills Gap, Training That Pays Off. I'm joined today by four esteemed panelists: Scott Kinney, Managing Director of Devonshire Investments; Andy Tempte, President of Kaplan Professional; Adam Enbar, Co-founder and CEO of Flatiron; and Tamar Ekelis?
It's Elkelis, but I
Elkelis.
usually just go with the first name. I'm kind of like Beyonce.
Right.
You know,
Nice.
Madonna, Beyonce, Tamar. Forget
Perfect.
the last name, it's
Perfect.
okay.
Chief Talent Executive at Atlantic Bridge Capital. Goal of our panel today really is to start to understand how skills can add value individually and how training can tie to those skills, and we can help talent populations upskill and advance their careers. So to that end, we have a series of questions that we want to pose, and hopefully you'll leave with some thought-provoking insights into how skills can be arbitraged and how individual companies and or learning providers can help talent populations. So I'll start the first question off, given we're at ASU GSV and there's a heavy post-secondary population. How do we feel the post-secondary training providers or learning providers, the traditional ones, i.e. 4-year and 2-year schools, are really preparing our talent populations for the skills and competencies that are needed for the future of work to fill the skills gap and then leverage that arbitrage?
Well, I'm happy to jump in. And thinking about it as a former college president and a current workforce technology focused kind of person, I think that in a sense, it doesn't matter as much because employers are increasingly just not expecting that from most 4-year institutions, and kind of going back to a model from the 70s, which is we're going to have to develop this talent ourselves, or certain skill sets, not talent in general, but certain competencies that are generally lacking, rather than putting pressure on universities to do that because they either don't think it's their mission or they already think they're doing the best that they can at it. How can we leverage technology to do this ourselves? That's an offensive, competitive issue, because if we do that as an enterprise, we're going to be more successful. But it's increasingly defensive because their millennial employees expect their employers to be investing in their skills. That's typically rated the top issue for younger employees. For baby boomers like myself, I think it's like 7th or 8th on the list. And so I don't think there will be continued pressure from employers. They've sort of given up, I think, on expecting most universities to do that. Now, there are other coding boot camps or other sorts of non-degree sorts of programs, maybe even community colleges. Sure, they can be better aligned with developing particular skills. But I think companies that are serious about this are going to have to do it on their own.
Yeah, so former a finance professor by training and also a former college president. The little bit of devil's advocate. There's some really cool things happening in post-secondary education. From a recent HBR podcast, the University of Michigan, their new dean of their business school, is doing some really cool experiential learning that will lead directly from that educational experience into skills that are needed in the workplace. Unfortunately, that's the exception and not the norm. And I do agree with you that many businesses have, quote unquote, given up and have accepted their fate, that they're holding the bag. But that doesn't that shouldn't forgive the college sector for their obligation to provide that kind of.
And there are universities like Northeastern who have made a really core part of their curriculum and have been working on that for decades, in fact, to smooth that transition from education to employment. And I think the ones that are doing it well will be competitively advantaged with students because a lot of them realize how important that is. I just think it is still the exception more than the
It is
the rule.
the average from an average perspective, colleges and universities are just woefully unprepared for this conversation. And worse yet, they're not talking to businesses about what the needs are. Faculty independence gets in the way of that.
So I was a chief learning officer at Qualcomm for almost 25 years, and I had the largest budget in HR, and it was all around development. And that's because the colleges and universities are not preparing the workforce. Now, the biggest challenge that we have is that we are developing people for jobs that don't exist yet. So it's very hard for universities to actually figure out what are the skills. I've met with thousands of universities over my tenure of being a chief learning officer, and that was to tell them what kinds of skills we needed. It doesn't matter. I still think there's an opportunity for educators to provide these foundation basic skills, right? That is a critical piece. Although, living in Silicon Valley and seeing what's happening today, people are devaluing degrees and really focusing on experiences. But let's get real, right? I mean, the number one place an employee goes to get information is where? A search engine. They go to Google search to get information. Where's the number two place that they go to get information? Their neighbor. So if they want to deal with a difficult employee or they want to know how to do a performance review, they're not coming to my learning classes. They're not going to universities to get it. They're searching to go find the information, and then they're asking somebody next to them, how do I deal with this issue? So the whole learning, the concept of learning has changed a lot. And then if you look at the Harvard Graduate School of Education has done a tremendous amount of research on 21st century skills that are needed. And I think they came up with like 25, but I just wanted to give you the top 5. What do you think is the number one 21st century skill that today's employees need?
Working on
Thinking
teams.
is number one. Thinking, okay, that's a big piece. Now, we're not teaching that at the academic level, and hate to tell you, but a lot of corporate education groups are not doing that either. The second one is self-understanding. Third is empathy. Fourth is ethics, and the fifth is communication. So let's just get real about what's happening. I think that there is a combination between what's happening at the academic institutions and what we're doing from a corporate learning standpoint. But there's a big shift in how learning is happening today.
Just to defend colleges for a minute, of those 5, I actually think colleges traditionally think it is their job for at least the first 4 of those. Communication, maybe, maybe not, but we've decided in this country to combine a coming-of-age experience to produce a better informed and more responsible citizenry with an acquisition of skills and competencies into one experience. Now that, you can't generalize because there are a lot of part-time students and adult students and online students, and it's starting to atomize in a lot of different ways. But but if you think about the traditional 4-year on-campus experience, I think we as parents, let's say, or taxpayers, we do expect people to emerge there better critical thinkers, more empathetic, able to communicate with, so I think
that would be great, but then I wouldn't have spent so much money educating an employee base,
Yep.
right? And for other CLOs that are sitting here as well, they know the big budgets.
But you're not teaching them critical thinking skills? Is that one of your
We are
focuses?
teaching them thinking skills and leadership and how to motivate teams of people,
Sure.
collaboration, all of those
Things like that,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Tamar, how do you, in your role, you're at the tip of the spear here, how do you get corporations to get off of the, I'm not hiring anybody unless they have a 4-year degree? How do we change the
I think that's happening. I think that's happening. People don't care about degrees. I mean, many of the startups that I work with today, they actually don't even care about degrees, and they don't really want you to have had experience. They want, what can you do for me today, and what can you do for me in the future?
That's
Which translates into skills. So Adam?
Yeah, so I agree, that list that you read, I could totally see an HR person answering a survey and saying, well, number one, I want critical thinking and communication and all that.
No, that was Harvard. It wasn't HR people. Don't bash the
Well,
HR people here. Any
No,
HR people in here, he just bashed us.
Not at all. My wife is the head of HR at a startup in New York. I could see those being the traits you're looking for, but that's given that you've already hired people that met other criteria. And I think employers are actually looking for, more than they used to 30 years ago, people that can come in and do the job. So those are all true, assuming you have somebody that can get the job done. 30 years ago, we used to hire people and say, we'll train you on the job. that's going away and we're looking for qualified talent. You know, your question was, are we, I guess by we you mean as a society, our higher educational institutions or our system globally, is it preparing people for the workforce? And I think the answer is objectively not, right? I mean, there's all the just basic statistics about how many people go to college, how many graduate, how many of those get a job that requires a degree. That system works for about a quarter of the population at best. And then layer on top of that the fact that at the pace that our world is changing and that the skills necessary to be successful are changing, the idea of go to school for 4 years and you're set for the rest of your life doesn't make any sense.
Well, we have to be nice to the healthcare sector because in colleges and universities, this is a sector that for decades has gotten it right in terms of teaching to the competencies that matter in the workplace because, well, lives depend on it. But and tomorrow, you know, the ASU GSV operates in this technology bubble world, but what about marketing professionals? What about finance professionals? That where the answer is, I need to see a 4-year degree. I agree the conversation is changing from in Adam's world and in the technical bubble that this whole group lives in, but there are a whole host of disciplines where it doesn't.
It's not actually a technical bubble. Sorry, Burning Glass just released a report that said that of the fastest growing and highest paying jobs, over 40% or over 35% require computer science skills, but less than 15% of them are actually coding jobs. So every job is becoming more technical, just like, I don't know when this happened, 500 years ago, at some point, every job started requiring people to be able to read and write. Like, you can't function in today's society without being able to leverage technology. And, you know, 10 years ago, that was being able to use a computer. But that's very quickly becoming actually knowing how to manipulate data.
Well, I would argue, though, it's not about a degree, it's about competence.
Exactly.
It's about skills.
If you can demonstrate some level of competency, then you can be a surgeon. You may not need that 4-year degree. I'm not saying that's happening today, but that's what's coming. Because if you look at the millennial generation, you look at our kids, they're not going to sit there for 4 years with traditional instruction anymore. It's going to look very, very different. It already is changing.
So as employment becomes clear that we need to synchronize around the skills and competencies that are needed, and there's a level of gap between that and what's being produced by what continues to be the largest cohort of education population coming through the traditional system, how do we begin to bridge that gap? And how do we, as a group, as a panel, start to think about how we can skill a population that can meet the strategic objectives of those employers?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is when I was at Qualcomm, a bunch of our engineers came and said, I want an MBA. And we're going, what are you doing? You're an engineer. What do you mean? You went to all of this, you know, you have your PhD from MIT in electrical engineering. Now you want to get your MBA? And we really dug deep with them and said, what is it that you really want? And they said, we want to understand finance. We want to understand marketing. We want to understand how the product that we create makes a difference in the business. And at the end of the day, what we did is we brought in all of these MBA professors and created a program for our employees, teaching them those specific skills that they wanted. And I said to them, do you want a degree from Northwestern on something? Do you want a degree saying at Stanford? Is that important to you? They're like, no, we don't care about the degree. We just want the knowledge. We just want the skill set.
And for those kinds of skills where they don't need the MBA degree to run their department, I mean, there are still a lot of employers who might require that sort of thing, but if what they're trying to do is acquire the skills, there are a lot of ways in academia and outside of it to do that. And
Correct.
MIT, just to use that example, through their MicroMasters program has done some really innovative stuff. Now, is it as current as what maybe a private sector company that is trying to upskill? Maybe, maybe not. But that's an example of how universities can move away from, I'm sure they continue to want their degree to have a lot of brand value and a lot of currency in the market. But that's how we can start meeting those sorts of needs.
Sure.
So as we're talking about this, it sounds more and more around the concept of unbundling a degree. How do we see the unbundling of a degree and adding value to discrete skills actually transpiring? A, do employers understand the value of the discrete skills? And B, how do learning providers, regardless of whether they're traditional post-secondary or alternate learning providers, begin to communicate the skills that they're providing, the value that it has to the employer populations? How will that communication take place?
Well, I would love to see a world where the core university degree, that first 2 years, possibly 3, becomes the, hey, we're going to create great citizens, we're going to create great critical thinkers, et cetera, all the soft skills that we've been talking about, and then reach a world where micro-credentials, small bits of knowledge, that first platform that Adam's company does a great job with of getting somebody in the door, and then stacking micro-credentials on top of one another to create that trajectory in your career, because the reskilling time, the time to reskill in the future is going to have to shrink from today's current kind of monolithic environment down to something much more reasonable, because my son's going to have 5 to 7 careers in his lifetime, and he, like a tree diagram, he needs the ability to A, be a great citizen, because high schools just aren't doing that anymore, to be frank, and get that citizenry badge, if you will, which is a future college degree, and then, like a tree diagram, be able to stack micro-credentials, and then all of a sudden, oh, that job went away because the AI took that function. Now it's time to reskill and go on another branch of the path. That's what at least my opinion, that's what the future of the connection between higher education and professional education / corporate learning needs to
And I would argue that credentials may not be important. Again, I'm going to go back to competencies, right? If I can show that I'm competent in something, I can get hired to go ahead and do it, right? If I can show that I'm a good critical thinker, then I can have 7 different jobs within a potential company.
Yeah, the problem is that the role that professional bodies like the CFA Institute or the AICPA, et cetera, the role that they're playing right now is they're playing the role of liaison between employers and the skills and competencies that are necessary. They're performing a highly valuable skill that nobody's really focusing on, which is doing the job analysis and creating the taxonomy and the curriculum that then supports what those employers are saying. Now, are they doing a phenomenal job? There's some gaps, certainly. But.
Yeah, but I actually agree with Tamar here that
Oh, good.
fundamentally, all a credential is a proxy for skills, right? So it's a shortcut to say, oh, okay, you have this badge from this place, and so we assume that you have this skill. I think most credentials are a terrible proxy for your actual skills. So that would imply that most of these kind of degrees don't actually represent somebody's real competency. But put that aside, whether or not they do a good job, I think we're very quickly entering a world where you don't need a proxy. If you need to hire a software engineer, you could look at their GitHub profile. If you need to hire a marketer, you could look at their email list and their competency with social media. If you need to hire a salesperson, you can get an export of their Salesforce data. And I think it's hard to imagine a profession that can't actually export data and give you a real sense of a person's competency without any sort of proxy or third party or governing body saying, okay, they pass these things, they get this stamp of approval.
And I think that's the most inefficient part of the system right now. I don't think that the signaling power of bachelor's degrees is going to go away for another 20 to 50 years. It's giant and clunky and expensive, but until employers start behaving differently, which they do with coders, but they don't with a lot of other things. But how do you assess, how do employers or potential employers assess those competencies in a way that's effective and repeatable? And I think those technologies, or a lot of companies here who are working on exactly that, and I think that will then become the communication vehicle between individuals and employers, between employers and their...
that's kind of the point of the panel today, right? This is talking about arbitraging a skill set. The employers who can figure out how to assess talent based on real competency and potential and not based on a credential, the people who get good at it faster are the ones who are going to have a competitive advantage in talent and be more successful. I think employers are already devaluing a bachelor's degree as a signal. Right. What the problem is, they don't have another way. You know, I talked to my wife about this. I said, well, if you get a resume across your desk that has Princeton at the top, is there any chance you're not going to give them an interview? She said, yeah, I'll probably give them an interview, right? Because it's still the easiest, strongest proxy to look at.
It's a baseline.
Exactly.
It's a baseline.
However, the employers that invest in figuring out how do I evaluate talent effectively outside of those proxies are going to have a huge competitive advantage.
And not just technical skills, which
any skills,
but some of these other high value, under-delivered skills
leadership
within.
assessment. I mean, a lot of companies are doing really rigorous assessment of talent coming in. So, for example, an organization that I know very, very well, that most of you know very, very well, does an entire 2-day leadership assessment, sends you all this information about what the CEO is saying, and then says, okay, now be the CEO, what would you do? That has nothing to do with the degree. It doesn't matter whether you went to Princeton. It's how do you think? How do you think strategically? You know, so I think that today the assessment piece is part of it, is we're assessing talent differently. And then the roles within organizations are changing so quickly that we as corporate learning professionals are forced to constantly be upskilling talent.
Are there underserved skill levels in this discussion? Are we having a discussion around white-collar jobs only? Or do we feel that this discussion around assessment and being able to signal skills and competencies can go to middle and low skill jobs just as easily?
I actually think the middle and low skill jobs, the white collar jobs can learn from them. And that, you know, aside from assessment, one of the things that, one of the ways in which you can actually get an arbitrage here is through apprenticeships. And that's actually very prevalent in blue collar work, right? You can't be a plumber or an electrician without an apprenticeship. We've run a lot of data on our graduates, and people that graduate and take an apprenticeship right out of our program, the apprenticeships pay a lot less than the full-time jobs immediately, but after the 6-month apprenticeship is over, their salaries are meaningfully, I think somewhere in the range of like 15% higher on average than people who take a job, a full-time job immediately out of the program, which communicates to the student that in your very near-term future, you're better off financially starting with an apprenticeship, but also to an employer that can hire somebody at a wage that is materially lower, and 6 months later they have somebody who on the market can command much more, means there is an arbitrage there, right? You can actually assess talent by giving people an opportunity to prove themselves through apprenticeship programs. So that's another way in which you can bring people in through non-traditional means, give them an opportunity to prove themselves, be able to sort out who's actually productive and who's a fit on your team, and end up with a workforce that actually is relatively cheaper than what you would have paid if you were looking for people who came in already having the skills and already having all the signals.
I think another underserved sector here is smaller companies. So 60% of the US workforce works for companies with fewer than 100 employees. They probably don't have an LMS. They don't have a big L&D department. They maybe have one HR person
Correct.
who fills all those jobs. And so either they're going to have to develop those skills and demonstrate their competencies on their own, or find a provider that the company can work with easily and implement without having all this infrastructure in place. And so I think that is definitely an underserved part of the skills development economy today.
Yeah,
The other piece that I think is really important, Corporate Executive Board did this research, and they show that 34% of US employees today are participating in the gig economy. So that's changing as well. The employee-employer relationship is changing. And then in 2020, they project that to be more than 43%. So you think about it, even though you have a degree, you have a skill set, you're working for multiple different companies during the same day, completely changing and shifting the way that we're thinking about the workforce.
Right, and the companies they work for the turnover will be very high.
Yes.
They've got to get them to productivity very quickly, and then they have to be able to demonstrate that they've mastered and sometimes that's a compliance requirement, but sometimes it's just getting them productive, and that's incredibly valuable to the employer.
Yeah, one more area where that's really left behind in the conversation is the concept of the accidental manager, the first-time manager. This, in terms of destroying corporate value, the first-time accidental manager, hey, you were great at coding, you did a great job here, and now we're going to put you in charge of these 5 people. Well, I have no idea what to do, but they take the extra pay and they just dive in, and they're not set up to succeed.
So I think what that also brings to light is kind of broadly, I think most of what we've been focusing on is new hires, right? And somebody kind of entering into a profession for the first time. But there's arguably a bigger gap in terms of retraining the workforce, because at the end of the day, we can create new models and boot camps and change the way what we teach in college, and then people kind of enter into the system and they're off. But given how much additional training is needed throughout people's careers, and given how fast it's growing, something's going to have to give, right? Employers are going to have to find a way to actually create space for real formal training within the system, whether it's totally reskilling their workforce on a somewhat regular every few years basis, or upskilling them. There isn't really a lot of room for that right now in the 9-to-5 job.
Well, we're in the United States, we are way behind here. We have a division in the United Kingdom, and there's this new apprenticeship levy over there, and highly structured apprenticeships are being spun up to solve.
Kind of. We have that. We have a similar system in the U.S. I was just I was in London 2 weeks ago meeting with the government about that, because we opened a campus in London. We're like, great, free apprenticeships. Problem is, companies have no idea how to. They're paying a tax right now in the UK. Companies with over 35 employees.
Philosophically, it's an awesome idea.
It's a great idea.
But it is a tax.
But employers are just like, okay, great. So I'm paying this tax, and I can get it reimbursed if I hire an apprentice. But I have to jump through all these loopholes. I'm not sure how to qualify something for apprentice. It's so convoluted that it's just like, you know what? Sunk cost. I'll hire people the normal way. So we also have to make it much easier for companies to do it.
There's also it's germane to the discussion in the UK particularly, there's a diametrically opposed thing to the actual path from 1988 until now, and that is they built all this university capacity to overcome what was a malfunctioning apprenticeship system. So now they have government-funded capacity at the university level and a mandate to increase apprenticeships. So there's a lot of friction in the UK on that topic, but it does lead me to think about who owns the responsibility here, and or who benefits from the arbitrage that we're discussing. Obviously, the employee population can benefit. How, and Tamara, I pose this to you, how do you see companies being able to benefit from this arbitrage opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, companies have not only responsibility, but an opportunity to provide learning and development so that they can be more productive and so that employees have higher levels of performance. I mean, I really do feel like in many organizations, what differentiates today is how much learning and development do you provide for career growth for your employees. So the number one reason that an employee stays in a company is career growth. So if you want to attract, develop, and retain talent, which is what everybody wants to do, and differentiate and come to a Qualcomm versus a Google or a Facebook, then you need to make sure that you have lots of learning opportunities for your employee base. And to me, that's a real differentiator. That's a competitive advantage. Interestingly, yesterday in Josh Burson's session, if any of you were there, he talked about the study that Deloitte did and showed that most people said, learning folks as well as employees, as well as employers, that there's only 24 minutes a week that employees have to be able to spend time in quote unquote formal training and development. Okay, 24 minutes a week is not enough, right? At the end of the day, though, learning has shifted. They are learning. They're learning on the job. You got the 70% that's learning on the job. They're learning by searching on their own. They're learning from talking to their neighbors. And so we need to be really focused on, I think, as employers and as employees, is how do we help that user-generated content? Many of you may be familiar with the story that came out a couple of months ago, and there was a 6-year-old boy that drove his little sister, who was 4, to the McDonald's to get lunch. Did you ever hear about this? Drove the car, right? And he got to the McDonald's window and is ordering, and they called the police. They're like, oh my God, we have like this little kid who's driving the car. And they said, sir, what are you doing? And he said, well, my sister was hungry, And so I drove here to the McDonald's to get her a Big Mac. And the officer's like, how'd you learn to drive? He goes, I watched a video on YouTube. Got in the car, drove his 4-year-old sister. Okay, that just shows you how learning is happening, right? And if you think about even the mobile world, and commonsensemedia.org has put out a lot of data that shows that 0 to 1-year-olds, 10% of 0 to 1-year-olds, 0 to 1 is like baby, right, are utilizing mobile devices. They're utilizing mobile devices. They can't read. They're not looking at a manual that we're providing. They're not going to some kind of a program to learn that. They're watching others, and that's how they're learning. So if that is the way people are learning today, there's a huge benefit for us to pay attention to that. The optics and utilizing that user-generated content is making a big difference.
On that 24 minutes available issue, the employers who are creating really engaging, compelling learning environments for their employees, they will find the time to use that because it's critical to their work.
If it's critical and relevant.
And they will share their learning with others. Peer-to-peer learning can be enabled through those platforms.
Yeah.
And I think that that's not only a way to retain that talent, and agreed, if you don't invest that, you're going to lose your best young talent. But it is a way to outcompete, be more productive, and focus on the skills you want them to develop, not just having them go watch whatever YouTube videos they think are the most relevant.
Yeah, Adam's point of making space, this 24-minute concept, the learning and development plan has to be aligned with the objectives of the corporation. And in far too many cases, they are not. And L&D, and don't take offense to this, I'm speaking in broad averages here,
right.
But L&D is off doing its thing
right.
and doing first-time manager training, et cetera, and the CEO is sitting over here oblivious to what's happening in L&D and wondering, why on earth am I not getting value for money from my L&D budget relative to my corporate goals? The two have to be linked up.
Do you think that the proliferation of alternate learning providers and the connection of those learning providers to corporate America, which is arguably deeper than that between traditional post-secondary and corporate America or corporate global, do you think that that potentially deeper relationship will help open the eyes of the CEO to understand that if they have the strategy of being an IoT company, they need to have the skills and competencies that make up IoT?
It's an ecosystem. I think that, academic education plays a role. I think that alternative learning providers play a role. I think there's mobile apps out there to be used for learning. I think there's video to be used for learning. I think it's a system that we're all part of, and I think the collaboration needs to increase.
I think the rapid growth of modern learning platforms that are aimed towards the individual, maybe through a corporate relationship, but whether it's Pluralsight or Lynda or Udemy, the pace of growth should be demonstrating to CEOs how much their employees crave this and want it and need it, and how are they going to then try to take a little bit of control of that, steer it along a learning pathway that is important to them. So I do think if they're paying attention that they'll notice how important it is.
I think all of these, while all of this is true, it's all relevant to the idea of upskilling your employees, right? Helping with manager training, helping become a better coder, helping become a better marketer, et cetera. And you can do that in a million different ways, videos, talk to your friends, learn by doing, et cetera. I think what we're seeing now is an increase in a need for reskilling employees, and that's actually new. And reskilling, I don't know that can be done with, watching some videos here and there. Like if I'm working in print at the New York Times, and that's just, my job is just absolutely not going to exist in 3 years, and I need to get a new skill for a whole new thing. I think we can build a system where it is worthwhile for employers to invest in giving those employees the time and the resources to gain an entirely new skill set, and I think that need will grow very fast. It's growing right now. But that's something that, there's absolutely no infrastructure or great set of standards for how we do that today. So a lot of these providers, whether the traditional one or alternatives, are built around upskilling and making that better and more efficient, which is great. But there's also this need for reskilling, and I don't think we have any idea how to approach that right now.
Yeah, the compression of those reskilling cycles in the future are going, and the current accreditation system of institutions of higher learning and the concepts of faculty independence kind of force universities to move at a slow pace. Alternative education providers aren't beholden to those regulations and are much more agile and flexible in terms of being able to create learning paths for cohorts of individuals that need reskilling in a short period of time, so that they don't have to rely. So it's an ecosystem.
And I think we're actually making progress on that reskilling dimension. There are a lot of great stories, and maybe they're good stories because there's only a few of them, but where companies are taking a couple of hundred displaced customer service employees who might make $50,000 a year, putting them through a program which is not just watching a few videos, it's more of a hybrid learning kind of program, and producing 80 digital marketers or a higher level skill, not necessarily trying to turn them into coders, but
it could be anything.
They could be data analysts at some level. So I think most of those experiments, if you will, have produced surprisingly good results. So I agree that that's an area we're heading down to, and it's going to be critical, but we're in the second or third inning, not the top of the first.
Yeah, and I think we're doing that inside companies anyway. You know, if we want someone to learn a new job or a new skill, we're developing them internally, having them work with someone else that's in that role. So a lot is probably happening inside organizations that we probably need to share with academic institutions to show how that's actually happening.
Well, so if that's true, how do you then validate that skill acquisition? Because it would take a long tail of time to truly validate. How are either companies attempting to validate that skill acquisition, or is it incumbent on professionals, or is it incumbent on learning providers to be able to show validation of those skills? If we're arguing that perhaps credentials and or degrees aren't that signal, and for coding, assessment, relatively logically, intellectually easy to understand how you do that. Write this code, see the output.
Yeah.
But for more discrete skills, how do we propose validation of those skills?
Validated through performance, through employee performance. That's the key validation metric.
Yeah, but we're talking about, you set the holy grail on the table, right? The ability to measure the adoption of skill in the workplace in this new regime. In the old regime, where technical skills were really all that mattered, can I balance a balance sheet? Do I know how to run a working trial balance? And I'm going to hire somebody based on those skills, and I'm going to measure skill acquisition in terms of those technical skills. The measurement was much easier back then. Now you're talking about the blend of technical and behavioral skills, because with computers that can think, the importance of those behavioral skills in the workforce are much, much more important. And how are we going to measure the adoption of critical thinking, or the adoption of communication, or the adoption of adaptability or flexibility? Those things are really, really hard.
I think companies are really struggling with this. And by the time they have poor performance in the job, it's too late. And that was really expensive. And it was a bad experience for the employee, terrible experience for them, bad for the company. I think the direction not to go is an expectation that there will be some sort of federally endorsed standards, and that's required for this to have currency in the marketplace. But I think, so don't endorse that direction. But I do think companies have to use subjective and objective assessment means and criteria to try to get 80% accurate view before you put somebody into that new job.
Well, yeah, I mean, like Andy said, this is kind of the holy grail. I spent a couple of years in venture capital before I started Flatiron School, and I specifically focused on innovations in education. And one of the things that kind of started to bubble up fairly often is the idea of a knowledge graph. That, you know, Facebook is who you know and LinkedIn is where you worked, but there's no ability to search for skills. There's no place where I can go and say I need somebody who knows Google Analytics and has writing skills and has management experience and performs well, and show me those people in my area, right, with 5 years of work experience. I'm certain there's at least 10 companies here at GSV that are startups that are probably working on it. LinkedIn is taking cracks at it. It's a huge...
We have talent management programs within organizations that have that with skill
within,
databases.
Yeah, within an organization.
Correct.
But there's no way to,
Correct.
like, broadly, there's no knowledge.
Market
It just doesn't
for that.
exist. And whoever figures that out
That would be great.
will be kind of very wealthy entrepreneur. But
LinkedIn is taking a really solid stab at this. I've been doing some writing on LinkedIn, and but the funny thing, we haven't gotten a laugh out of this crowd, and hopefully this does it, is
It's a high bar
LinkedIn
you
thinks
set for
that
yourself.
the jobs that I should be applying for in the future is minister. Because I've been writing about the importance of behavioral skills in the workforce, what is accountability, things like that. And so they're offering me up minister jobs. What? So
Don't
holy
knock it.
grail, we got to get a lot better at this.
So how can we, circling back to the subject of the panel, how can we begin to think about signaling to both employees and employers the value of these disparate skills? What are some things that you've seen work to help communicate that, both from an employer perspective and from an employee perspective?
My opinion is senior leaders really got to get involved. There's a lot of pushback, organizational health, continuous improvement. These are critical to your bottom line, and a lot of leaders just still don't buy in, and it's all about the technical skill that matters when somebody joins a company, and then they sit back and scratch their head. Well, why is this accidental manager failing? Why is this first-time manager failing? Because they're not putting the resources and the muscle behind it. Companies that have adopted the principles of organizational health, there are a number of studies that are saying that really does matter to the bottom line, and so it's getting folks to wake up to it.
I don't think it's just CEO commitment. I think it's rewards and recognition. I mean, ultimately, if people get rewarded, they're going to learn differently, do differently, their behavior is going to be different, they may perform differently. So it's a systemic issue in that it's not just CEOs think it's important, HR organizations and learning and development professionals are providing all kinds of opportunities. It's you're gonna get paid for that and rewarded for that.
And what gets measured gets done. So how do you measure that in a way that makes some sense, so you can base your rewards and recognition on something that people buy into, and then move your culture forward so that people want to do that because they know they'll be rewarded for it.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be where knowledge was power, right? The more knowledge you had, I'll keep it to myself because if I share it with someone else, they could get promoted or they could get more money. And instead, in the world today with millennials, they share everything, right? So it's about sharing where I ate and sharing what I know and sharing who I talk to and sharing what I read. That notion of how we share knowledge is changing. So it's no longer just me versus you, it's all of us together, and that social component is different today. The rewards are changing.
Is transparency around the dollar value that various skills have in terms of salary uplift, be they either technical or soft skills, a proxy for those rewards, or is that reward enough, put a different way?
One thing that I think Unilever and some other companies are doing is they're identifying and sharing what are the appreciating skills and value. Whether they put hard numbers on it or quantify it in some way, they're signaling to the organization these skills are becoming increasingly important to us and by extension to you, and even identifying which ones are becoming less important. And I think it's a bit of a bold way of communicating with your organization, but it's putting it out there that these have economic value to us, to our clients, to our growth, to our shareholders, and so not only do we expect you to be working on this, we'll make it easy for you by giving you the tools to do it.
But going back, that takes that forward thinking by the senior team of really, really aligning the objectives of the L&D department with the goals of the company. And you know, we're all leaders up here. That's really hard work. And there are goals to build the top line of the business and cut out the middle and grow profitability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this conversation, unfortunately, gets lost in that shuffle.
Agreed. Well, as we continue to think about skills and training, what do we see and where do we see the future of training going as it pertains to this new world of work? And I'll ask each of you to opine on that topic as we wrap up our panel for today. Scott?
So I'd say one area to focus on, which is getting some attention, but probably relatively less, is how do companies deliver learning experiences and platforms that are effective? And it's not just consuming content online, it's things like mentoring and coaching. And these, we learned hundreds of years ago that mentoring and coaching, well, probably thousands of years ago, are an important way that people learn and retain new skills. And so I'm really interested in technology that can scale that at a reasonable cost so people are getting the mentoring and coaching that they need in a way that you can spread it across tens of thousands of employees. This isn't to back away from the importance of your mentor who's your boss or the person, but we know how people learn. We've got to find better ways, and mostly we focused on giving them content. So how can we do things like mentoring and coaching, rewards and recognition, all the other ways that it's been proven how people learn.
Yeah, this might be a little controversial, but I think we have to really change the conversation and go back a few steps, back into our homes, back into our K-12 systems, and the conversations that are happening with school teachers and children and parents and their children about the concept of lifelong learning. The future of education will only be successful, again, my opinion, if the average citizen is coming out with the perspective that I learn for my entire life. Learning does not stop. And unfortunately, we have way too many conversations that just hang in there one more year, Johnny, you'll get your high school diploma, and then that's all the learning you'll ever have to do. That's just got to stop.
So I think we, in terms of our current systems of higher education, are over-indexed on not the value, but on just the percent of time we spend on becoming a better citizen and all the other kind of softer things. Some increasing portion of our time needs to be devoted to actually putting people into careers. If you're an employer, I think with regards to new talent, you are at a competitive disadvantage if all you're looking at is traditional ways of evaluating talent. You're paying more for talent that's not necessarily more effective, and at the end of the day, in our economy, like, talent is everything, right? Your team is the measure of success. So you have to be looking for talent in non-traditional places, and when you have that talent, you have to find ways to upskill and reskill them effectively. And you should be looking at it as an ROI equation, right? Because that's ultimately, if it doesn't deliver a positive ROI to the company, nothing we do is going to last. And then educational institutions need to be conscious that this is the way employers are thinking and to adapt accordingly.
Okay.
In that rush, though, which is an important one, to increase the competency sets of young workers, let's not back off making them better citizens.
Well,
I think there's a real risk there.
I think we do, unfortunately, a poor job of making great citizens, and I'm not saying we should back off of that. I'm saying right now, 95% of our attention is on that, and maybe we should give an extra 10 or 15% to actually helping people kick off good careers. I'd argue that somebody who's financially stable and happy with what they're doing becomes a better citizen.
Okay, future of learning, 5 things. Social, global, mobile. Personalize it and prescribe it.
And on that very prescriptive note, I'd like you all to join me in thanking our esteemed panelists. Thank you.